The agenda this week debated the future of bilingualism in Canada, considered the conservative appeal to working class people, and examined this country's problem as a haven for money laundering. The agenda's Week in Review begins asking, which Great Lake is the greatest of all? Have a look.
We're going to start with some opening statements here, and we'll go in order of size. So Lake Superior, come on in here, get us started, and tell us why your lake is the greatest Great Lake.
It's in the name. I am Lake Superior, as my infamous Twitter handle suggests. Lake Superior is the greatest of the lakes. It feeds the water for the four other Great Lakes and is large enough to contain all the water of the Great Lakes, including 3 extra Lake Eries. If that's not great, I don't know what is.
Some strong points there, Megan Leslie. You're doing Lake Huron. That's the second biggest. What have you got to say?
Well, it's hard to pick just one lake, so luckily with Lake Huron, you don't have to, because it's 2 lakes for the price of one. It is Lake Huron. It is also Georgian Bay. That is part of Lake Huron. So 2 different ecosystems, 2 different cultures, 2 different experiences.
Also some strong points there, Your Worship. What have you got to say?
What I've got to say is that when you think of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, this is like Goldilocks and the 5 lakes. And when you look at the 5 lakes, I'm going to take you through, over the course of the next half hour, I'm going to take you through why Michigan is the perfect lake. Unlike Superior, which is too big and too cold. The other one is Lake Huron is too rocky. Lake Erie's too shallow. Lake Ontario, I'll get into why Lake Ontario is not at the top, but Michigan will be number 1 at the end.
Like Goldilocks, just right.
Just right.
All right, gotcha. Serene Fox, come on in here. Lake Ontario's the best because?
Well, it is small, but it is mighty. Lake Ontario is actually, you called it out. You said Superior had it in its name. But one of the traditional names for Lake Ontario is Nigani Ichigami, which means the leading sea, which quite frankly makes it the leader of all lakes. And if you follow my traditional migration story, you'll come to see just how important it is. So yes, Lake Ontario has some of the most iconic coastlines in Ontario and Canada. So I'm looking forward to telling you just a little bit why Lake Ontario is absolutely the best lake.
And we look forward to hearing it. Okay, Tony Decker, you're batting 5th in this lineup here today. Why is Lake Erie the best?
Lake Erie's the best because it's comfortable to swim in all summer long. There's beautiful beaches. It has Point Pelee and Pelee Island is a through route for migratory birds, super important for our environment. And the Lake Erie provides the lake effect that creates the microclimates that's perfect for growing fruits and vegetables and grapes in the Niagara region. So all of that stuff we enjoy from the Niagara region is a result of Lake Erie's lake effect.
I have to say, strong opening statements from everybody here. This may be more difficult to judge than one had thought. So let's go around for a second round here. Okay, Lake Superior, come on in here. You gave us the opening statement. Let's dive in a little deeper now. You've heard some of the criticisms. Lake Superior's too big, it's too cold. What do you say to that?
Too cold? There's no such thing as too cold. There's just too weak. Part of Lake Superior's power are the intense conditions, the 30-foot waves, the blustery winds, and the squalls. It is a beautiful to experience that inclement weather.
All right, Megan Leslie, you heard the criticism over here. Lake Huron, too rocky.
Oh, come on. So we have Lake Huron, and when you go, Sarnia to Tobermory, it's got these white sand beaches. They're beautiful, lots of swimming, big waves, and then you do have the rocky shores of Georgian Bay, those iconic images of that white pine blown and twisted in the wind. So I think it's really exciting and dynamic that you get the best of all worlds with just this one lake.
It's very Group of 7, isn't it?
Isn't it? It really is.
You look like you're looking at a painting when you're looking at
You walk through the Art
Georgian
Gallery
Bay.
of Ontario, and you're basically right there.
Right on. Now, okay, Walter, I'm going to put this out here because I think maybe you have the toughest job of all the 5 representatives here. Because your Great Lake, is any of it in Canada at all?
It's all American. It's got 4 states that touch Lake Michigan: Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. Mm-hmm. So it is an American lake. There's good Americans out there. And this is the great American lake. And when you think of Michigan, You think of freshwater surfing. It actually has the best waters to surf in freshwaters out of all the freshwaters in North America. If you've ever been to Sheboygan, you know that you can surf in the Great Lakes.
The current Prime Minister's father did have a dream once upon a time of a country where millions of people could speak both official languages and communicate basically in both official languages. Not perfectly, but basically. Is that dream, in your judgment, essentially dead?
Well, for someone of my generation, obviously, I'm the first generation to have grown up under official bilingualism. So for someone of my generation, when Quebec politics, for instance, was at the core of a lot of what happened in this country, the dream is dead. I mean, I write a column for the Globe and Mail, and because I'm based in Quebec, I write a lot on Quebec politics, and I just notice over the years how there's so much less interest in the rest of the country for Quebec politics, and there's so much less investment on the part of Canadians outside Quebec in trying to bridge the cultural divides in the country. And that's largely a function of how much Canada has evolved since the Official Language Act was passed. There are more people who speak Mandarin and Punjabi outside Quebec in large parts, or certainly in most parts of the country, than speak French. And so and partly it's a function of the fact that there's just not enough qualified teachers outside of Quebec to actually teach Quebec French to English Canadians. So it's a complicated story, but yeah, I do think the dream is dead.
Was the dream, JJ, in your opinion, a fool's errand to begin with?
I think it was. I think it was always based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what this country was. You know, I think when you had leaders like Pierre Elliott Trudeau, these were people that were very much products of Quebec political culture that very much sort of conceptualized the existence of Canada as like a marriage between Quebec and Ontario. And that was like the fundamental reality of this country. And thus a policy like bilingualism made a kind of sense if you conceptualize the country that way, as kind of a marriage, you know, the two founding nations, a very Eastern Canadian sort of centric conception of what this country is. You know, I'm from Western Canada, I'm from Vancouver. So we have a very different understanding of the history of this country, which is that, yeah, perhaps that's how the country started, Ontario and Quebec, and then, you know, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. But then, you know, the entire western half of this continent was, you know, annexed and colonized and was settled by waves of people from Eastern Europe, from other parts of Europe, speaking all sorts of different languages, and then, you know, people coming from Asia and from Africa and elsewhere, and creating, you know, what I think even by the late 1960s, early 1970s, was already a very diverse, multicultural country in which the idea that this was fundamentally a bilingual, bicultural country was just a dated and incorrect assumption. And I think what we've seen over the last 50 years is a failed social experiment based on false assumptions, trying to turn this country into something that it wasn't even at the time that the Official Languages Act was introduced.
A failed social experiment.
Well, let's come back to that legislation, which was the Official Languages Act. We think about it in terms of bilingualism, but if you read the legislation, it allows for Canadians to remain monolingual. It's the public service from the federal government that will be offered in the language of the citizen that requests the services. So it's not a legislation to make every Canadian bilingual. The dream is at another level, I would say. It has been a vision that of the politicians of that time.
But do you still ascribe to that dream? Do you still aspire to that dream?
Well, it is partly achieved and mostly where the highest concentrations of bilinguals are in Quebec, in particularly Montreal, among all the francophone minorities outside of Quebec. That's where the level of bilingualism is the strongest.
Louisa, to what extent do you think francophones who live outside of the province of Quebec, to what extent do you think they currently feel under threat?
Some of them, I think, with the recent census data, feel definitely under threat. And I really want to underline what my colleague, Monsieur Labrie, just said about the actual numbers have been growing, even though the statistics, the percentages go a different trend. And depending on the regions and the locations, so geography does play a role, both in the degree of bilingualism the possibility to live in one or both languages, and the feeling of threat. So currently, with the numbers and some of the recent policies, Francophone minorities feel under threat. Even within Quebec, being in Quebec City, in Montreal, or in Gatineau is very different. In Gatineau, there is definitely more of a feeling of a threat because of the presence at the interprovincial border with Ontario of English being there and potentially invading.
Sean, I want to pick up on that line. We have changed what it means to be a progressive conservative in Ontario. And the Premier's contention that he's created a new coalition, which obviously includes private sector labor unions as part of it. Do you see that as a brand new coalition in Ontario politics these days?
I think the short answer is yes, Steve. In a way, Canada is slow in this broader trend occurring across Western societies, what's sometimes referred to as a realignment of our politics. Viewers will be familiar with Donald Trump's unorthodox voter coalition, or the British Conservatives' breaching of the so-called Red Wall in northern England in the 2019 election campaign. It reflects a kind of a sorting of our politics in which education is increasingly a major proxy for whether you vote for the left or you vote for the right. And I think what Ford has done, frankly, better than any conservative in the country, is start to recognize this trend and reorient the party's messages and policy agenda to reflect this new accessible voting group, which comprises working class Canadians.
Armin, I'll put a different quote to you, this one from an NDP insider who said about the last provincial election, "We gave up the working class to get the chattering class, and we do great with the chattering class." So said this NDP insider. If that's accurate, do you agree that was a bad trade?
If it's accurate, it was a bad trade. But is it accurate? So I think there's a lot going on here. I agree with Sean that Canada is late to the party, but within Canada, the Conservatives have been the most adept at understanding that population aging means the smallest working age cohort we have seen in half a century, and their vote is very valuable, and it's time to go after them. And so they wrap themselves in the flag of the working class, but in fact do not represent the working class or present a path. Their policies, their messages are on, but their policies are not on to the path that is required to move towards the economy of the future, which is going to value workers more and more. And that's actually the fight for all parties to take part in. The Conservatives just got out the gate fastest.
Okay, John, in your view, has the NDP given up on the working class in order to get the chattering class?
Well, yes and no. I'm not sure about the premise of this question. If you look at the coalition that Mike Harris put together in the 1990s, you look at the coalition that Doug Ford has put together now, I'm not sure it's all that different. Traditionally, the Liberals and the NDP own the city centres, whether it's Toronto or Ottawa or London. The Conservatives own the rural areas, and then they fight over the suburban ridings in between the two, especially the suburban ridings of the 905, the ridings that are outside Toronto. And in the mid-1990s, Mike Harris put together a coalition of rural and suburban voters, immigrant voters, working class voters, middle class voters, that I think resembles a lot the coalition that Doug Ford put together as well. That said, it is clear throughout the Western world that there is a move afoot by Conservatives to grab the loyalties of working class voters. And to some extent, it's succeeding. I'm not sure yet how much it's succeeding in Canada and whether it's succeeding at the federal level rather than the provincial level, but it's out there. And of course, it is based not on economic values. You know, it's the what's the matter with Kansas argument. Why do working class voters not vote for policies that one believes would advantage the working class? It might be because there are other things other than economic self-interest.
I think this is going to come as news to many people that we are apparently a haven for money launderers. Are we really?
You know what, Steve? Yes, we are. So Canada has a AAA credit rating. We are a G7 country. We have a modernized international system of trade. And that makes us incredibly lucrative to money launderers worldwide. The more stable of an economy you have, the more attractive it becomes to launder money. Experts estimate anywhere between 45 billion to 113 billion is laundered annually each year. And this is known as snow washing, where international marketing firms or international law firms have marketed Canada as a secrecy jurisdiction to incorporate a shell company for the sole purpose of avoiding tax and to launder money.
Now, Mark, I suspect most people know what money laundering is, but for those who don't, what's your best definition of what money laundering means?
My best definition would be you take something that is illegal to get the profit out of it, and then you recycle it into the economy, but into something legit. So you take something which is totally illegal and you convert it into a legit activity by using, as Sasha was pointing out, the Shell company and other operating companies too.
And do you agree we're one of the big countries in the world where this happens?
Oh, yes, we are. It's not something that we should be proud of, but yes, we are.
And do you also sign on to this anywhere from 45 billion to 113 billion? That's an enormous amount of money.
Oh, yes, and I would have no problem believing that it's probably closer to $100 billion than it is to 40-something billion. It's only an estimate, but to be honest with you, it's really hard to come up with a clear number because it is actually illegal. So they're not disclosing it in financial statements, but it's at least $100 million. It's very, very lucrative.
Huh. Okay, Rita, we've got an organization in this country called FinTrack, which is supposed to keep an eye on this. What's FinTrack?
FinTrack is our federal anti-money laundering watchdog. It is the financial intelligence unit for Canada. And it collects a lot of information from banks and other reporting entities on suspicious transactions that take place. So it's a data collection agency to a large extent. So a bank, for example, if it notes a transaction is suspicious in some way, it'll write up a report, it'll send it to FinTrack, and FinTrack is used by law enforcement. The information that they provide is used by law enforcement to prosecute these cases.
And what would be something that would be considered suspicious? How is it suspicious?
I mean, it's pretty broad definition. I mean, anything can be considered suspicious. I mean, there's a lot of talk of, if a transaction is over $10,000, it is automatically flagged to FinTrack. That's true. But a bank doesn't necessarily have to wait for somebody to cross that $10,000 threshold. Anything can be considered suspicious. FinTrack collects a lot of data. Millions and millions of reports go to FinTrack every year. But there is a question, and this was addressed by the Cullen Commission, there is high volume reporting to FinTrack, but how effective is that?
It turns out, I'm one of them, I know you're one of them, a lot of people who got vaccinated got COVID anyway. And a lot of people who got vaccinated transmitted the disease to other people as well. And I'm wondering if, as you look back at it, and admittedly, hindsight's 20/20, do you have any regrets about the salesmanship used to convince people to get vaccinated? In other words, did you oversell them? Did you give people the sense that if they get vaccinated, they're sort of in the clear, when in fact, quite clearly, that has not been the case?
Well, as you say, retrospectively, Steve, certainly, if you look back now, there has been understandably a misunderstanding about what a vaccine can do. The one thing that has been crystal clear, that the differences in severity of disease and death and hospitalization between vaccinated and unvaccinated people is profound. The likelihood of getting into a severe situation leading to hospitalization and deaths in an unvaccinated person is multifold higher than in a vaccinated person. Yet, there is a perception that vaccine will prevent you against infection, and that isn't the case. It does somewhat prevent you from getting infected, but not nearly as well as it does to prevent you from getting severe disease. So it's understandable how a person can say, well, I've been vaccinated and I've been boosted and I still got infected. So what you were telling me wasn't particularly true. I thought I was going to get protected against infection. When the real issue is that if you didn't get boosted, the likelihood that your infection, which likely was mild to moderate, might have put you in the hospital and might have killed you. That message in the beginning was not as clearly articulated as it likely should have been. Now we know, and we say that all the time, you get vaccinated and boosted to protect you against severe disease. But it is understandable how early on, when the vaccines first came out, that people had the understandable perception that it was going to protect them against getting infected.
You've faced not only considerable admiration from people who appreciate your public service, but also, I think it's fair to say, unprecedented hate in your life as well. I mean, people have tried to kill you. The governor of Florida said you were some little elf who need to be chucked across the Potomac River. Why do you think there's a, I mean, it's some of the stuff is laughable, I agree. Why do you think such a sizable chunk of the American population not only distrusts you, but has actually come to despise you?
Yeah, what I think it really is, Steve, is a reflection of the profound divisiveness that we are experiencing in this country, the likes of which I have never seen. I'm an elderly person. I'm 81 years old. I've been involved here at the NIH for almost 60 years. I've been the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for 38 years. And I've been involved with multiple outbreaks, leading from HIV/AIDS through Ebola and Zika and pandemic flu and the anthrax attacks, and now COVID. I've never seen a public health issue get entangled in political divisiveness, the depth of which we see in this country. It really is striking, and it should never spill over into the field of public health.
That's just some of what we've covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.